today is the Kannada Shiva Bhakti movement, and why have I actually chosen this topic majorly is because I've been trying to trace the origins of this community. It's actually a very fragmented community in many senses. There are many subgroups which have their independent origination, histories of origination. So this is a part of that larger facet of studies that I am inclined to do. And yes, the next slide. So this is a few review of literature, the books that I have quoted from. Primary sources generally are from the Vedas, Channabasava's Purana, etc. Next slide. Then this is the secondary source. Next slide. Go next slide. Yeah. So the my introduction essentially to the Vachanas started when I actually came across A.K. Ramanujam's book, and it started with this first Vachana of Basava. That was, the rich will make temples for Shiva, what shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, the body the shrine, the head a cupola of gold. Listen, O Lord of the meeting rivers, things standing shall fall, but the moving ever shall stay. Now, initially this appeared to be very revolutionary, and that's what the intent of the author was, to actually present a reformatory, revolutionary anthology of the subject of Veerashaivism and the prehistory of it prior to the 12th century. My own take it actually started wavering in the sense that there was an entire polemic about the Veerashaiva tradition being very diverse, very different from the pre-existing Shaiva traditions and the pre-existing Hindu traditions. So I actually try to critique it in some way. And next slide. Yeah, so this was actually a critique of colonial scholarship. And I found that these were the major four authors of who spoke on Veerashaivism, and they shaped the entire meta-narrative on the subject of what Veerashaivism and the 12th century Kannada Shiva Bhakti movement was all about. So you had Arthur Mills, who was the first one to kind of call Basava as the Luther of India, and his book, The Land of the Lingam, is actually a very disparaging account of the Hindus. It's complete condescension in that sense. So that was one part of which my critique I had to take up. The other one was C.P. Brown, and he actually saw Protestant parallels in Basava's preaching and his teachings and in his vachanas. Immediately following Brown was P.G. Phagu Halakatti. Halakatti is called as the Vachana Pitama because he actually brought the Vachanas to the fore. But the problem with him was he fell for the colonial narrative in that sense, because the community of the Veerashaivas were shaping to the new modern realities. There was a certain anxiety in the community to kind of keep pace with modernity. So they brought in these really new ideas of Basava being a total, a Martin Luther of the Indian masses, of that sort. And then you have M.R. Sakhare, who essentially brings in this whole separationist and that Lingayatism essentially is a different religion, and it doesn't have a prehistory which is connected to the mainstream Shaiva culture. Next slide. And the problems of the colonial narrative that I saw, and I'm actually going to contradict today, are these: that Sanskrit versus local languages, it's like an offshoot of Aryan versus Dravidian debate in India. The caste and untouchability as inherently Hindu, Vedic, part of the Hindu and Vedic religion, but not part of Lingayatism. And the worship of Ishtalinga as opposed to idolatry. And the fourth one is shunning temple worship. Next slide. So these are my nuanced readings on the same topic, and I've predominantly only used the Vachanas from the 12th century and not after that, because people will say that it's not up to the given mark. So first I trace the lineage. Just in the Indian tradition, everything has to have a lineage. And I try to trace the Basava Adi Sharana's lineage to the pre-existing bhakti strands in the Indian tradition. The second one is the alignment of the Kannada Shiva Bhakti with the pan-Indian Sanskrit tradition. The third is caste relativism in Hindu theistic and bhakti traditions. The fourth is the concept of Ishtalinga, which has a prehistory, is a prehistory of a pre-Basava root, and when many of the symbols and paraphernalia of the Lingayata community essentially are, rooted in Shaiva, in the Shaiva tradition. And the fifth one is that the Bhakta personifies the temple, that the temple worship was totally shunned by the Veerashaivas, Lingayatas. I hold a contrarian view. I show that, in present times as well, Lingayatas and Veerashaivas actually go to temples, and even historically, you see their connection to the temples has been very well documented. So the next slide. So the modalities of Vamshavali in the Kannada Shiva Bhakti movement, there are three strands of Bhakti. So what a lineage essentially is, like it serves dual purposes. One, it transfers knowledge, and the second thing it does is actually it gives legitimacy to a tradition. The second one is the forerunner of the tradition can be spatially and temporally distant. It need not be that they are in a linear succession to one another. And the third one is that the Shiva Bhakti movement from Karnataka appropriates through emulation and becomes a successor in the ideological lineage of the previous three strands of Bhakti. Next slide. So the three strands of Bhakti that I found in Basava's Vachana is the pre-Basava Kannada Shiva Bhakti movement, which is actually epitomized in the figurehead of Dasaya. And the second strand that I found was in that of Sindhu Ballala and Siriyala, who are actually Nayanmars belonging to the Tamil Shaiva tradition. And the third strand is a Puranic tradition, which actually is pan-Indian. Now, I spatially and temporally divided these into I've divided these into spatial and temporal groupings. So the pre-Basava tradition was actually spatially and temporally closer. The Siriyala and the Tamil Shaiva Bhakti tradition was spatially and temporally distant, and that which was the pan-Indian Shiva Bhakti tradition that spoken in the Purana is temporally and spatially beyond the space and time boundary. Next slide. So the next slide is it is about Sanskrit, and the question was many of the Indologists previous year were actually questioning whether the Kannada Shiva Bhakti movement was part of the whole Sanskritization process or not. It may not have been part of the Sanskritization process, but there are several evidences within the Vachanas that there are several Vachanas which have a lot of Sanskrit terminologies. For example, mostly those terminologies which are linked to theology. Theology of the Veerashaiva and the Lingayata tradition. That, for example, you have the Guru Linga Jangama, you have the pented of the pented of Vibhuti Padodaka, and many other things which are part of the Sanskrit vocabulary in the Veerashaiva tradition. And in some way, the Kannada Shiva Bhakti movement, because its use of the Sanskrit language so extensively, it becomes a part. It's trying to align itself with the grander, the larger pan-Indian Sanskrit tradition. This is my take. Next slide. And I've marked a few vachanas, which I show that, essentially they borrowed from places as good. I mean, they say, generally there's a saying that Veerashaiva is anti-Vedic and so on and so forth. But you see, actually, Siddharama in the 12th century does quote a lot from the Vedas. For example, this is quoted from the Rudrashtadhyaya of the Yajur Veda. And you see, Om Namah Somaya cha Rudraya cha, Namastamraya cha Arunaya cha, Namah Shringaya cha Pashupataya cha, Namah Shivaya cha Shivataraya cha. This is part of the Yajur Veda. And then you have Basava's own Vachana, where he quotes essentially from, I believe it's from the Shiva Dharma Puran, but I need to corroborate it. It is Chandala Vatikayam va Shiva Bhakta Stito Yadi Tat Shreni Shiva Lokasya Tad Griham Shiva Mandiram. So the essence of this is that the 12th century Sharana movement actually broadly takes from the Sanskrit tradition, and it uses the Sanskrit words to legitimize and to be part of a grander Sanskrit narrative in India. The next slide. Okay, this is back again the theological terminologies that you find in many of the vachanas, and these are not one-off vachanas. These are in many vachanas you find them, and in the later theological corpuses of the Veerashaiva Lingayata tradition, you do find these used extensively. The next slide. But in contrast to the 12th century Kannada Shiva Bhakti movement, you have the Tamil Shiva Bhakti movement, which uses Sanskrit words, but it is Tamilized to a great extent, and they still prefer to use more chaste Tamil. So in contrast to these traditions, although the 12th century Kannada Shiva Bhakti movement borrows a great deal from the Nayanmar tradition, it still parts ways in terms of linguistics. Next. Bhakti and scriptural basis for caste relativism. So one question generally people, point to the Veerashaiva Lingayata, they're actually anti-varnashrama, which is to some extent true. But there are several verses and several quotes and verses from Puranas. For example, the Shiva Purana, it says even a Chandala who wears a Rudraksha over his body and Tripundra on his forehead is worthy of respect. He's the most excellent of all castes. And the Bhagavata Purana almost narrates the same story, and it's not just it's just not part of the Shaiva tradition, but also in the Vaishnava Bhakti tradition. You find that there is a certain caste relativism that is, part of the Bhakti discourse. Now, the intent probably of the authors of the Puranas would not necessarily be to kind of bring in a revolution or a reformation of some sort, but these ideas were generally to just show the greatness of the religious paraphernalia of these traditions. For example, Vibhuti, Rudraksha, and in some cases just chanting the name of the god. So these are the highlights of those verses. But, over a period of time when these narratives are rotated in gatherings, they kind of become canonical in some senses. And over a period of time, you see the bhaktas would have accepted this as canonical literature and would have opened their society to all caste groups in turn, allowing them to be participants in a ritual, in a ritual arena or a spiritually pure arena. The next slide. Is the comparison between Appar and Basava. For example, what Appar says in the 7th century, Basava almost word to word, almost similar, but not that similar, echoes the same sentiments in his 12th century Vachana. And you see this over here. Next slide. So now we come to the indisputable Shaivite markers. For example, Vibhuti, Rudraksha, and Linga are very deeply tied with the Shaiva tradition, and it's an unalienable part of the Shaiva's identity. And, the Vibhuti and the Rudraksha are just worn as any normal Shaiva would wear, in 3 lines and, a whole set of Rudraksha malas. In addition to that, the Veerashaivas and the Lingayatas and even Basava and the Sharanas in their time would have worn a Linga. So it actually begs an answer to my question is, if the Sharana movement wanted to actually depart from the mainstream Shaiva tradition, why would it incorporate Shaiva markers of piety into their tradition? So, until we get a very well-substantiated response, we probably cannot accept it to be a separate religious tradition in that sense. The next slide. So the Linga, now I would like to establish the antiquity of the Ishtalinga tradition. So the Ishtalinga, essentially, you find the earliest epigraphical reference to something that is equal to a Ishtalinga. It is actually by the Bharashivas who, wore the linga on their body. And this is around the 3rd century onwards, where you find this inscription is by a Vakataka king who mentions the Nagas as the ones who carry the weight of Shiva on their shoulders. This is represented in a lapidary form in the 9th century Kodambalur temple belonging to the Irukavel dynasty. And they were actually, the shrine essentially was closely connected also with the Kalamukha tradition, which essentially is a predecessor of the Veerashaiva tradition in many ways, especially if you look at the genealogies of the Hulimata Parampara, you do find that, there is a certain antecedence to the Veerashaiva tradition in the Kalamukha tradition. You find the same lapidary representation also in the Chalukya, 8th century Chalukya image and lapidary representation of Aihole. And this is actually in the Bombay, CSMVS Museum in Bombay. Next slide. So the Ishtalinga, essentially in scriptural terms, I have used only the Shiva Purana. I have not touched the Agamic tradition because there's a lot of debate on that and we cannot vouch for whether it was introduced later or it was part of the Agamas previously. But the Shivalinga, the Shiva Purana essentially gives you two such verses where the Ishtalinga practices existed, but it was it was exclusively devoted to the ascetic traditions. But what happens during the 12th century essentially is that you see that the practice of giving the linga to non-ascetics kind of, it grows leaps and bounds in that sense. And you see all people from every caste groups are capable of getting initiated into the linga dharana tradition. The next slide. This is another lapidary representation of the Karasthara Puja, which is another name for the Ishtalinga Puja. The earlier one is from the Kalamukha temple at Baligavi, and this was Shalva Pillai who had given me this picture, and he has actually written a Facebook post on that. He was supposed to write an article, but he's very sufficiently clear that it belongs to Vama Shakti, who was a Kalamukha ascetic. And if you see, the linga is actually placed on the left hand, and the Kalamukha ascetic is offering flowers to the linga. The same thing, you find it on a later date lapidary representation. It's of the 17th century, and it's a post-Vijayanagaran period lapidary example. And you see the similarities between the two ascetic traditions. Siddharama also is, by the way, an ascetic, not like the one he is depicted today. For example, in Raghavanka's Ragales, he's clearly he is called as the Lakula. So he actually, in this you can see that there is a continuance of the Ishtalinga tradition from the Kalamukha tradition to the Veerashaiva tradition, and there is probably no period of a hiatus between these two traditions. The next slide. So this is the Ishtalinga that is worn by Veerashaiva Lingayatas today. Initially, and this is Mysore, which is probably 17th or 18th century. You see the linga is a proper Panchasutri linga. It's like a full-formed linga. But over a period of time, and this I've been, after interacting with the Veerashaiva community, what I was told that, because the Veerashaivas on the breakage or the destruction or the loss of the linga, they would have to commit ritual suicide. So therefore, one of the Swamijis had some pity on them and said that, in order to kind of reduce this kind of this wanton suicidal attempts, so we could cover the linga with kante and the linga would be safe. So the linga in the later era evolved into what is the last representation over there as a big block that looked like a stone, and it is covered with the soot of a lamp mixed with resin. The next slide. So the temple worship, which is generally considered to be taboo amongst the newer proponents of the Lingayata tradition, I would like to show that these two shrines, especially the Sri Shailam temple and the Siddharama temple, and I'm just using the Shaiva temples because both of these temples have lingas. So these shrines, and because the Sthavara linga is actually considered to be very problematic in the Veerashaiva tradition, both these shrines have Sthavara lingas, and the Veerashaivas are active, a part of the priesthood in these temples. and they hold in some cases they hold exclusive rights to the worship of these deities. The next slide. The bhakta's body becomes the ambulatory temple, and this is Akka Mahadevi's vachana, and she is supposed to have quoted it from the Shiva Dharma Purana. She says, "Ishtalingam avishwasya tirtalingasya pujakaha shwanayonim shatam gatva chandala griham acharet." So, for example, what she is intending to say is that the Ishtalinga that is given by the Guru has the weightage of the tradition, has the blessings of the Guru, and by rejecting it, one is essentially rejecting the tradition, and one is rejecting also the line of also the efficacy of the linga to grant liberation. And she speaks against worshipping the Sthavara Linga only in context to this, the rejection, the showing of disrespect to the Ishtalinga given by the Guru, and therefore not to the entire gamut of temple worship. So this is what essentially the Veerashaiva tradition actually inherits from the Vachana saints of the 12th century. The next slide. In conclusion, I would say that there are two, continuation and departures within the tradition, and how this tradition mediates between the two dipolarities. The first one is that Kannada Shiva Bhakti movement adheres to the scriptures and draws legitimacy from it. But it has an epistemic hierarchy, and in that epistemic hierarchy, the Apata Pramanas, the Pramanas of the Puratanas and the Nayanmars, are far more superior than those of the Vedas and Agamas. This is clearly cited even by Siddharama in his Vachanas. The next one is, in the ritual and devotional spaces, castes were originally also, diverse caste groups and lower caste groups were also allowed into the ritual arena. But in the Veerashaiva tradition, they were far more proactive. They continued that tradition, what the Dayanars had instituted. They allowed for various caste groups to be part and parcel, and also to dine and interdine in equal measures amongst them. And the third one is that the temple is still a sacred space, but now, when the 12th century Basava the Sharana movement becomes it's a watershed movement. It actually introduces the concept of the ambulatory temple, which was already there, but it was exclusively for the ascetics. But now it's been transferred and transposed upon non-ascetic tradition, non-ascetic individuals. So this is the sum of my research that I've done extensively. If you would like to to see it, it is in my paper. I have covered several other dimensions to all the four the points of contention. That's all. Thank you.